Hi there, and I'm about to save you 61 minutes and 30 seconds of your time. That is, if you are an INFP or an ESTJ, there are two things you need to keep in mind. That is, number one, don't be lazy, and number two, don't be selfish. There you go. Good wisdom, and in fact, I'd say it universalizes. I don't think any of the types should be excessively lazy or selfish. But yeah, there you go. Saved you 61 minutes and 30 seconds. You got all the messaging that you needed from that sage advice, and I hope it's helpful to you.
Hi again, and sorry, the fun part's over now. We're going to go to the plotting and pedantic part of the video for the bulk of the video. This has to do about C.S. Joseph's released Secret Power Obsession of ESTJs and INFPs, Exposed. The video was released to the public about a month ago, but I believe it's quite a bit older than that. It was held as a premium membership video for some indeterminate time before that. So I don't know if it's a year old, many years old, but there are some ideas there that I think are worth exploring. Some more disclaimers. I don't know C.S. Joseph, of course. Probably few of us here on the YouTube channel know him directly. I have nothing against the guy. I would have said in the past that C.S. Joseph's ideas are subject to bad thinking, but I don't know that that's fully accurate. It's not that his ideas are bad, it's the coupling between his ideas and mapping it back to MBTI that doesn't seem to work. And case in point, when I self-evaluated through the UJA app, I think that's how you pronounce it, UDJA, I self-typed first time as an ISTP, then I went through TypeGrid to see if I could make better sense of my type and saw, or self-assessed, that I am an ISFJ under the C.S. Joseph system. However, I consider myself to lead with FI and NE. Therefore, in a more traditional or conventional Jungian sense, I would be an INFP. So, my answering the questions here is going to be a little odd because I'm not an INFP in the C.S. Joseph verse, but I think it's important for me to perhaps provide insights or thoughts to contribute to kind of the greater universe of thinking when you find someone who leads with FI and NE and how that might map back to CSJ's ideas. So I think that's enough of a preamble. There's probably a couple things I'm forgetting. But yeah, overall, let's start tackling some of these points that were made in the video as questions. And the one with which to start, I think, is this point that INFPs and ESTJs conceal their motivation. So is that the case? Well, I would say to an extent it's partly true in that I'm not overt in much of anything I do. If you look at the Linda Barron's way of interaction styles, I would be considered a behind-the-scenes interaction style. I'm not out there making my opinions or plans typically known or leading with those things. Rather, I would prefer to observe and see what other people have to say, and if I have then something with which to respond or some which way that I think is the most correct action, at that point I would step in. Now, the idea that my motivations are so dark and morbid, or they're somehow in some way objectionable, that I would be in fear of my reputation if they were to become known. I suppose everyone has got some dark internal thoughts that they wouldn't want to talk about because it's not really relevant. If I look at what I see as my motivations, and I think I am a person of older persuasion, so I think by now I would know something about my motivations. I think first I value peace and comfort. So yes, I like to be comfortable. I live in a nice place. I eat regularly and prefer to have foods that I like, get regular sleep. I like to ride my bike. So I guess that is a motivation for me, is good weather to get out and do things. And then I prefer a lot of alone time to evaluate or contemplate different ideas. In fact, cycling is part of that alone time, getting out there for 2 or 3 hours and just being in my own head for a while, I find as being immensely therapeutic. So other motivations that I've got in the world would include I want people who enjoy tabletop role-playing games to be able to have the time to indulge in those hobbies, because the bigger those communities get, the more likely I've got fellow gamers with whom to play or to even run those sorts of games. So on a purely selfish point of view, I have a motivation that I would like for there to be, say, more labor rights, more workers, more strength for workers, because when the rank and file has got additional leverage for taking vacation days and more leisure time to do stuff that they like, then that plays well for me, that I get to have interactions with people that I want to have. And I mean, yeah, few folks will turn to tabletop role-playing games, they'll do other stuff, but that's my motivations. I mean, if there's something that I'd really like to do, I've had this dream that I could just sit under a tree for an entire day from sunup to sundown and just kind of observe everything that happens over the course of an entire day. And I think that would be really neat. Those are my motivations. I don't see that this is sneaky or particularly morbid. I mean, if there are darker motivations, it's probably not anything all that exciting. I mean, and it's not anything on which I would want to execute. You know, the beasts of the id are things that we all would experience. And so to call these things out would be not to say anything that's unique. Okay, question 2. Are INFPs especially afraid of what other people think of them? Yes. It's a matter of being FI dominant and supported by any auxiliary. You spend all of your time in your own head evaluating things that are of interest or importance to you, and that subjective importance, and constantly throw into that new ideas, new contexts, new angles. So when someone allows this kind of contemplation to occupy their time, and they come out with evaluation conclusions, God forbid, but comment things into the ether, into the communications interfaces with other people. And there's some sort of a screw up that you mean goodwill, or at least you don't mean to stand out, and you say something really stupid, and it makes people think less of you. It's kind of, there's a failure there. So yes, the reality of it is that I do care very much what other people think of me, and I do have a fear of having my intent be misconstrued and having people come down on me for things that I may not have meant. So absolutely true. And to extend this a little further, the idea of public shaming is really an awful, awful thing to do to someone who leads with FI and NE, who basically just wants to contemplate, think about things may churn out something that they think is a good idea. It could be a really terrible thing. But then to be publicly humiliated for it, it's you're kicking them in a place where there's no real defense. This goes in line with something that I would kind of describe as a reverse Barnum effect, that when you get folks who lead with FI and NE, those kinds of INFPs, and you tell them things about like you're selfish and you're a bad person and you have all of these bad motivations, the trouble is that using FI and NE, the process with which to evaluate that is very challenging and time-consuming, because it's like, well, this could be true. Let me feel if I know it to be true. And if I don't feel it in this context, let me evaluate the next context, because perhaps I haven't thought of the right way of my selfishness or my evil intent yet. And let me do that again and again from this angle and from that angle. And then it's at some point it becomes possible to ferret out to say, yes, indeed, I recall that I have been selfish and I see that within myself. Therefore, this accusation of being selfish, of being mean-spirited, of being delusional, of whatever the accusation is, can be seen as correct by an INFP, because it's like I searched within myself deeply enough to find the thing that you're looking for, to find this presence of a dark thing. But it's not different from any of the other types. The difference is that an INFP, maybe an ENFP, maybe some of the other types, can see this within themselves, can see the potential of this within themselves. And so there's a vulnerability to this sort of gaslighting. And if you're using this to accuse an INFP of all sorts of, basically pulling all sorts of terrible things, it's a bullying tactic. And an INFP, bona fide INFP, doesn't have a good defense except for that fourth slot TE, to say, I discount the credibility of this source. And that's where, that is basically the only defense against this sort of gaslighting, is to say, okay, I finally reached a point where this source is no longer credible, therefore I can cut it out and realize that they're not coming from a position of objective assistance. It's coming from a malicious source. It's someone who has their own agenda, who's trying to accomplish their own goals by ego hacking, so to speak. So this is really kind of an awful thing to publicly shame an INFP. It would be plenty, if you're talking about Jungian INFPs, it would be plenty to go back to one and say, look, I don't believe this is accurate. And then, okay, let's have a discussion. And yes, a lot of the time it's going to be hard to change the mind of this kind of INFP, but the discussion being had, it's possible to inject those ideas and see where the outcome leads. Okay, next. Do extroverted thinkers care more about being respected than they care about being accepted? Well, seeing as TE users are half of the overall population, I can't speak for that, but to speak for myself, and maybe this is a type 4 Enneagram thing, but I would generally agree that I'd like to be both respected and accepted, but historically I find that I have not been always accepted, and so I'm not too uncomfortable with sticking out from the crowd or differing in my opinion where it's necessary, and then And those times I would say I would like to have my opinion respected. So yeah, I would say that's generally true. Next, is public shaming scary to the INFP? Absolutely, for reasons that I've already gotten into. It's kind of an awful thing to do to an INFP, and it should be, I would hope, a thing of last resort. But of course, some people may get their kicks out of doing this as a first resort, and they don't care if other people feel bad. I mean, that's your choice, I suppose. And let's see. Next. This is a long one. It's the question of, do ESTJs and INFPs make up the majority of people who are elected representatives, presidents, congressmen, senators, House of Representatives, legislatures, judges, lawyers, or anyone that has to do with public service or public policy or policymaking? This is clearly false on the face of it, and it's easy to tell why, because if you look at the history of, here we're talking about the context of US politics, because House of Representatives and all of that, presidents and such, that's not the case in every country. But if you look at the history of politics in the United States, in the 18th century, 19th, 20th, and now 21st century, the character of our politicians has changed pretty drastically, generation to generation, century to century. So what is considered a requirement for politicians today is very different from the politicians of, say, the 1800s, which is very different from those founding fathers from the 1700s. And clearly, INFPs are not, and ESTJs are not a common thread across all of those founding father to modern day requirements. I mean, it's just to say that, say, AOC and who's one of those equivalents? Let's say AOC and Thomas Jefferson shared the same personality type. They're INFPs both, right? Or ESTJs? No. These are different temperaments for different times, and with that go different personality types. So I couldn't tell you the first thing about who's what personality type historically, but the historic record clearly bears out that this is not the case. And while we're on historic record, the case of tarring and feathering was brought up, and the idea that there's this fear that INFPs and ESTJs have of being tarred and feathered because that's what happens to politicians. Look it up, because that's not what happened to politicians. Tarring and feathering in the United States happened mainly with royalists, and in particular with royalist tax collectors. So this was not part of this group that are judges, lawyers, and policymakers. I guess it could be put under the category of public service, but it was done with royalists, with tax collectors, and then later to African Americans as part of the darker history of the United States. Politicians, as far as I can tell, generally were not part of that class. More frequently, you might have also seen some criminals where there was vigilante justice that was done for some crime that was not prosecuted in another way. But tarring and feathering is not something that's that was not a political solution. It was something that was done in specific times to specific people that don't line up to the ESTJ, INFP conjectures that were made here. So next, do INFPs hide their true motivations? Do they hide what they actually want by covering it up with delusions and or submitting to their own delusions? Well, there's kind of two pieces to that. I think I've already discussed the motivations, and I've tried to get to what I see as my motivations these days, which are not all that ambitious. But in terms of what do I cover things up with delusions or submit to my delusions? Well, I do have a rich idea of what my world entails. And I think I've talked about some things recently about reality versus what's real to the mind. And so I understand that my worldview is colored by my perceptions. Now, I don't believe in stuff like manifesting. I think that's all kind of a load of hoke. But the idea that you surround yourself with certain people, with certain things, you build your environment to your preferences. So is that a deluded thing to do because you're not seeing the world for what it really is, but you've assembled the world that you want to have? That's kind of a question I would put in front of you. Like Peewee in Peewee's Playhouse. Was that delusional? Or was it someone who engaged in some creative world building, even though they know what the real world, quote unquote, is like, but they chose to have this fantasy world of their own that they've created and fostered because that's the world in which they want to live, what they want to inhabit. They're quite aware, the actor behind Peewee, Herman, I've forgotten his name now, but basically he was certainly in the real world and familiar with what the real world was all about, but he created this character in this environment because I would say it pleased him to do that. And also he got paid a good amount of money, but you could see where others would create worlds like this for themselves that don't reflect the real world, but reflect their own ideas and image, or their own ideas and preferences into the world. So yes, I surround myself with things that reflect how I would like the world to be. And is that delusional? I don't think so. But I would think that most people would prefer to be around the things that they prefer, that they would prefer their life to be like. So, about INFPs, if they even look power hungry or seem power hungry, is this something that will reduce the amount of power they have? Well, let's go to, let's keep going here, down to, is power literally involved in every decision that INFPs make? Everything that these people do in their life is centered around power acquisition or brokering of power, because that's the thing an ESTJ and INFP crave the most out of life. I'm currently in my career stepping down from a position of power. I came to that position of power more by requirement. The need was there and someone had to fill it. So that's what I did. And then 18 months ago, I communicated to the management that I would like to step aside and no longer be in that role of power. I guess in a sense I would still be a power broker, but even those things I recognize it's just work. And so I guess I don't know where I'm acquiring this power. It would seem, perhaps I could say I am aware of the existence of power and of its importance, because I've been on the receiving end of people more powerful making decisions over which I have no say. But I don't know that that is anything to do with my own, say, lust for power. I guess the next piece to that is this definition of power, to say, is power a person's capability to change their life circumstances on a whim. That is, with no limitations and at any moment. That's a very strange definition of power, and I would disagree with that entirely, because if I look over my life, I am committed, or have been committed, to a mortgage. I have a home. These are things that are requirements that limit my options. I have been married for 20 years. This limits my options, I would say, in a positive way. I have had this career where I work a large chunks of time, and I'm required to do all sorts of things for that career. And if this idea of power being the capability to change my life circumstances on a whim with no limitations at any moment, then I'm one of the least powerful people around, because I am required by obligation. I'm required to fulfill all sorts of obligations. And part of this is done purposely, because being SE blind, if I didn't have obligations to fulfill, nothing would get done. So this is a very strange definition of power that doesn't really jibe with how the world would define power. And if I were to define power as this, what seems to me more like an idea of freedom, we'd have to go back and have an entirely new discussion about what power is about. But I think that between us, we can probably say the common definition of power has something more to do with influence, authority over others, not just the freedom to make decisions, but the authority to have them executed, so that there's something larger than oneself. Okay, on to the next. There's this definition of authority is the power to determine or educate or otherwise settle issues or disputes, jurisdictions, the right to control, command, determine, and having legal power to make and enforce the law, an accepted source and information and advice. Okay, I mean, that sounds a lot like power to me, and power and authority kind of going hand in glove. I'm not going to take a lot of time to explore that for its logical or definitional accuracy, but sure, whatever, let's stick with that. Okay, next question. Are INFPs treacherous because they're only loyal to what can give them more power, and they can never be loyal to something or someone, especially in a relationship that makes them feel powerless? I don't know what a relationship that makes one feel powerless would look like. I think with any relationship, there is some degree of autonomy, and if we map autonomy back to power, there's a shared responsibility, and there is some authority each over the other person in that sharing. So if you take this kind of cynical, power-centric view, then I would be hard-pressed to think of any relationship where one person holds all of the power and the other holds absolutely none. I guess it would be the INFP holding absolutely no power, and what that would look like might be what being ordered around by someone else, having no time to oneself, and just basically being told what to do, when to do it, how to do it. And yeah, I mean, that doesn't sound like a relationship. That just doesn't even sound viable. So I would say this idea that you're only loyal to what can, it's not even about loyalty. Would you be in a relationship with someone who makes you feel powerless, completely powerless, as in stripped of all power? Your autonomy is gone. You have no say over anything. That's not a viable long-term relationship. So I would say this whole treachery thing is a little bit of a it's a little sleight of hand. Loyalty and treachery has very little to do with this sort of criteria. If we get to the point of loyalty and treachery, yes, once upon a time, I did something where I was in a relationship where I followed the letter to the law, but I did betray someone. I was in my teenage years at the time, and it was a betrayal not in letter but in spirit. And SI Treachery took that into account, and I have never done that since, and I expect never to do that sort of thing again. So yes, treachery is a possibility, but I think it universalizes. There are people that I would expect be more susceptible to betraying others, where I screwed up once, I learned my lesson, I didn't do it again. Okay, next question. INFPs, so stuck in their fantasy land within their life, they're constantly manifesting things, abstracting manifestations. They believe that they can transmute those abstractions and make them real. I don't know that there's really a question in there to answer. I've already said that, yes, you can build your own environment. And if INFPs do that more than others, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily delusional, or if they live in a fantasy land, it doesn't mean that they don't know what reality is. Okay, next question. Do ESTJs and INFPs feel that if they regard themselves as an authority and give off that perception to others, they will be elevated to positions of authority? No. I suppose because of my interaction style, I may seem authoritative. For instance, here. And it isn't that I'm looking to be an authority necessarily. The primary driver here is that I see things that are out of alignment, that is, they're not congruent. The same way that an INTP would look and see something that's logically inconsistent or inaccurate, and it gets under their skin because there's an inaccuracy that needs to be fixed. I would say in a similar vein, my primary driver is that there is a misunderstanding, an incongruence, something that just doesn't line up, and so I feel compelled to say something about it. And then, this might be the last question. Do INFPs assume that because authorities already have authority, that they have to be right, because if they weren't, they wouldn't have any authority? Well, that goes back to the TE question. There's one point that was made earlier on about fake it until you make it, that INFPs engage in that. I would say this is something that I have not done, and I've never done, insofar as I know. There might be an obscure case at some point in my life, but I have not faked my talent. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. Kind of like being an engineer, I've often led with the discussion with things that I or we cannot do, what isn't possible, what the shortcomings are, what where the potential errors or other weaknesses are in a discussion or in points, as I did with my upfront disclaimer. This, I find, would be much more in keeping with an INFP's thinking, again, the Jungian INFP with FI and NE, that similar to INTPs, you play defense. That is, the things that you step forward to make claims about, you want to try and make sure are defensible claims. So the way that I've tried to discuss this topic today, given that I have SI and FI in my stack, and basically it's a very subjective stack rather than objective, I try to bring everything back down to myself because I know me and I can speak for myself. So when there are these assertions made that all INFPs do this, all INFPs behave that way, logically speaking, if I do not do these things and I am not this way, it means one of two things. Either I am not an INFP, or the logical assertion is incorrect, and it would be some INFPs do this and some INFPs do that. And at that point, we can start looking at the extent to which a lot of the points here that were made about ESTJs and INFPs, in fact, universalize. So that is a lot. If you've still listened this far, well, again, God help you, but thank you for doing so. And for a parting thought, I would repeat what was at the start of this discussion, which is a universal advice, which is to say, don't be lazy and don't be selfish. These are things that people should learn when they are still young and growing up, and that they should retain. And I think that, or I would hope that all of us pay attention to our better virtues, and that we strive to be better people. And, well, I know that I strive myself and don't always succeed, but I am hopeful that this maybe provides some insight. One final thought. This is important because when Ingrid posted her C.S. Joseph critique, a lot of comments YouTube ended up throwing down the memory hole. If you would like to comment, especially if you have objections to what I've said or want to engage in a deeper discussion, please be aware. The algorithm for YouTube is ruthless, and it's just taking stuff down whenever it detects even the slightest hint of, oh, this might be controversial, oh, this might be, So even having an enlightened discussion is becoming very difficult, thanks to YouTube. Thanks, but no thanks to YouTube. So I would love, I don't want to delete any comments unless somebody gets really aggressive and foul. I would love to have discussions. YouTube is keeping us from having those discussions, and therefore I'd suggest if you want to talk about specific things, maybe try a comment here, a comment there, because there's nothing more aggravating than writing 500 words of a deeply thought out essay and then YouTube goes, gone. So as it's done to me and others when we were trying to have these kind of deeper exchanges. So yeah, I'd say keep it short. I will keep it short as well if there are objections. I'm guessing that most of this is so boring that probably few people are going to comment, but I've tried to provide a perspective, come clean. Again, I think C.S. Joseph is not wrong in the way that he describes these kind of rather one-dimensional approaches to what is power and authority and loyalty and these different, and the 7 sins, and introduces all of these different virtuous and sinful concepts. Where I think it goes wrong is that it doesn't map correctly back to cognitive function stacks. So that's kind of where, to be honest, when I watch other MBTI YouTubers, if MBTI YouTubers that come from the C.S. Joseph camp, very rarely do I manage to sort of connect what's being talked about back to the type that the person identifies as under the CSJ typology framework. But that could be, maybe I've got it all wrong and CSJ is the one who's got it all correct. But be that as it may, that is kind of one other consideration in all of this, is that we may just end up being two different frameworks using the same language, talking past each other because of a lack of understanding. Anyway, enough. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.